Hi everyone, happy Tuesday. Hope you guys all had a good Labor Day and enjoyed your day off from school. So today we're going to go ahead and hop right in. We need to start with a short lecture on To Kill a Mockingbird, just kind of an introduction before we start reading. We've been doing a lot of pre-reading, trying to gain some context. So a couple more days of that and then we will start reading later this week. So on Google Classroom, you should have access to this To Kill a Mockingbird notes. And so everywhere you see a blank, that's where you're going to fill in a word or a couple words. And then down here you've got some room. I'm going to ask you for some predictions too. So as far as these blanks, it's easier when the paper is printed because you just write right on top of it. But on Google Docs, when you type, it's going to separate the line like that. That's fine if you're okay with it. Or if you don't like that, you can just delete the whole line and type in the word. So whichever way works for you, I don't care as long as you are getting the information and it makes sense to you. So I am going to screen share my PowerPoint, but I'm going to do this first blank with you just so you can kind of see how to do it, and then the rest of these you're going to be on your own to do as I'm talking and you're watching this video. So here we go. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the genre of this novel. So genre is something that you're probably familiar with. You have genres of movies and you also have genres of books. So for example, a lot of people like horror movies. You don't go to a horror movie expecting something funny, right? That's a very specific genre. There's also action movies. There's romantic comedies. There's all different types of genre. And depending on what genre that is, you kind of know what to expect in the movie. It's kind of the same with books. A lot of people, they'll read fantasy books. In a fantasy book, you're going to expect some sort of magical element, right? Whereas in maybe a romance novel, you're not going to expect that as much. So that's what we're talking about when we say genre. So the genre of this book is called a Bildungsroman. That's how you say that, Bildungsroman. I know it's a really, really weird word, Bildungsroman. All that means is it's a coming-of-age novel. So you can kind of think of it's almost like building. And so if you're thinking about like building something, you're going to stack things on top of one another and it's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. It's kind of like if you're coming of age, if you're growing, you're developing, you're learning, you're getting bigger, you're learning more, you're learning more, you're learning more. You're building on your knowledge, you're building on your age. So Bildungsroman. So this genre, it's going to concentrate on the development of the protagonist, and this development can be spiritual, it can be moral, it can be psychological, or it can be social. So in some way, the protagonist is growing and developing, and it usually follows from childhood to maturity. And so we are going to see that in our novel. Our protagonist is named Scout, and she is a very young girl in Alabama, and we're going to see how she grows and develops as the book goes on. She starts off as a child, and at the end of the book, she is still a child, but she has grown and matured a lot over the span of the novel. So that is the genre. So on your notes, what you would do, you're going to type Bildungsroman. To Kill a Mockingbird is a Bildungsroman or coming-of-age novel. So you're just filling in the blank. Bildungsroman or coming-of-age novel. If you don't want to backspace the underline, you could just type it like that, and that's totally fine too. Alright, so now for the rest of them, I'm going to let you do them on your own because I don't want to have to switch back and forth between the PowerPoint and the notes. So just make sure you are keeping up with them and filling in all the blanks. Obviously this is a video, so you can pause, you can rewind if you missed something, and it's really easy. Alright, so back to it. So, Bildungsroman. A little bit more about the genre. The character is usually going to undergo adventures, some sort of inner turmoil, inner conflict, and then again that growth and development as a human being. Some characters, they'll come to grips with the reality of the cruelty in the world, so maybe with war, violence, death, racism, and hatred. We are going to see that in the novel. Our protagonist is going to have to deal with the harsh reality of the racist South. And she's going to see a lot of violence and a lot of hatred, and that is going to push her in her development and growth as a person. It could also be dealing with family, friends, or community issues. We'll see that in the book as well. So now a little bit about our author. Before you read any book or any text, it's always good to have a little bit of context about who wrote it. That'll give you a little bit more insight into what it's about. So this is Harper Lee. First name is Nell, but she's always just referred to as Harper Lee. She was born April 28th, 1926 in Monroeville, Alabama. So that's a small southwestern town. Lee's father was a lawyer. As a child, Lee was a tomboy who loved to read. She enjoyed the friendship of her schoolmate and neighbor, the young Truman Capote, who some say the character of Dill is based on. And so this slide is really interesting because there are a lot of parallels between Harper Lee and between the main character in the book. Obviously, we haven't read it yet. You haven't met the main character yet, but some similarities. Harper Lee's father was a lawyer. Our main character's father is a lawyer. Lee was a tomboy. Our main character is a tomboy. Lee loved to read. Our main character loves to read. And then you also have this best friend, Truman Capote. In the book, the protagonist's best friend is Dill. A lot of people speculate that they are based on one another. A little bit more about Lee. She studied first at Huntington College in Montgomery, Alabama. Then she pursued a law degree. She spent 1 year abroad at Oxford University, and then she published her first and only novel, To Kill a Mockingbird. This won the 1961 Pulitzer Prize, and it was very, very popular. It's sold more than 15 million copies. It's one of the most well-known novels of all time. And so now on your notes, you should be at the section that says predictions. So from the title on the novel, or of the novel, sorry, predict what the plot will be about. So pause this video, go in, make a prediction or two. What might the plot be about To Kill a Mockingbird? And this brings us to historical context. So this book is set in the 1930s, and so it's important to kind of know what's happening in the world and in America at this time. So this is when the Great Depression hit. And so you've probably heard about this in your history classes, and we'll talk about it a little bit in here. But again, this is in the 1930s. It's set in Macomb, Alabama, and millions lost their jobs during this time. It especially hit the farmers really hard. More than 750,000 farmers lost their land. And then even professionals like lawyers, they had a hard time too because nobody could afford to hire them. So Great Depression was a really, really hard time. You can see a picture here of a family that clearly is struggling. And a pretty shocking statistic is the income per capita for families in Alabama at this time was between $125 to $250 per year. A whole year, that's all they had to live on. Some more historical context of racism in the South. Hopefully you know who this guy is. This is Abraham Lincoln. But even though he freed the slaves in 1863, blacks, as we know, were still not treated equally. By 1932, approximately half of black Americans were out of work. They couldn't find a job. Nobody would hire them. In some northern cities, white people would call for black people to be fired from their jobs as long as there were whites out of work. So they would say, you know, the black people, they're stealing our jobs. You need to hire the white people. And then racial violence is very common, especially in the South. So even though slaves are technically freed, things are still really, really hard for black Americans at this time. Jim Crow laws, this may be something you've heard of, but maybe not. This was the 1890s to the 1960s, so most of the states used the Jim Crow laws, and this was a way to enforce segregation. So essentially this was legalizing keeping white people and black people segregated. So some of these laws, blacks and whites were not supposed to eat together. Black people could be introduced to white people, but white people would never be introduced to black people. If a black person rode in a car driven by a white person, they had to sit in the back, couldn't sit in the front. White motorists had the right of way at all intersections. And a black man could not even offer to shake the hand of a white male or female. Couldn't even shake the hand of them. The Ku Klux Klan was also happening at this time. So after the Civil War, this was formed to promote white supremacy using violent actions against black people. So if you aren't familiar with this term white supremacy, that is basically the evil idea that the white race is somehow superior to other races. So that's what the Ku Klux Klan believed. They were formed specifically to promote that idea that whites are better, and they would use violent actions against black people. After the 1920s, the KKK kind of quit caring if they were secretive. They weren't secretive anymore, and they would form lynch mobs against black people. And again, if you're not familiar with that term lynch, essentially what they would do is they would get a mob of people, they would go find a black person, and they would hang them from a tree just because they were black. And this was becoming a very common occurrence. You can see the hatred and the racism here very, very prevalently. The Scottsboro trials. So this is something that was happening in Lee's life, and a lot of people say that her book was inspired by this trial. So Lee was 5 years old when, in April of 1931, the first trials began about the rape of 2 white women by 9 young black men, and you can see the black men here. The defendants, they were nearly lynched before being brought to court, but they were not even provided with a lawyer until the very first day of trial. So their lawyer had no way to prepare. They didn't have anybody to talk to them about the case, to hear their side of it, but they got a lawyer on the first day of trial. And so there was medical testimony that the women had not been raped, but the all-white jury found the men guilty of the crime and sentenced all of them, except the youngest, to death. The youngest was a 12-year-old boy, and he was not sentenced to death. I think that he was sentenced to life in prison. 6 years of trials saw all but one of the men freed, but the Scottsboro case left a deep impression on the young Lee, who would use it later as the rough basis for the events in the novel. So trials, they kept appealing. I guess they finally looked at that medical testimony. They looked at the evidence. They realized these boys didn't do it. All but one of them were freed. Don't know what happened to that one that wasn't. But this case really left an impression on Lee, and she used this kind of as a rough basis for her novel. So the N-word, we're going to talk about this more today, but just as a little bit of a preface, in the United States, the N-word was first used as derogatory in the early 19th century. The term was initially used in front of the first name of a black slave to distinguish them from a white person. Although the word is still used in some forms of expression today, song lyrics for example, the term is an abusive slur that is offensive and harmful. So again, we will talk about this a little bit more, but we're not going to say the word. It will show up in the book because this book is set in the 1930s. It's trying to expose a lot of the hatred and racism of the past, and so the word is used. However, in here, we're not going to use it, so just say the N-word. And so, in 1960, in the middle of the Civil Rights Movement, Harper Lee published her novel. It immediately shot to the top of the New York Times bestseller list, and it showed that the U.S. was finally ready to read a story about segregation and racism, and to maybe open their minds a little bit about the possibility of equality between whites and blacks. So the book is set in the 30s, published in 1960, in the middle of the Civil Rights Movement. So Harper Lee is really trying to kind of push the boundary, really trying to show why we need equality for the races. And that is the end of the PowerPoint. So you should have all of the blanks filled in. There weren't too many. Again, if you missed one or missed a couple, just rewind the video, go back and get whatever information you need. And so hopefully that gives you a little bit more context about To Kill a Mockingbird.